Well, if the U.S. doesn't back up Israel, Israel can't even keep up the war in Gaza, much less a wider Middle East war. The war in Gaza, the U.S. has just sent one carrier group back from the region back to the United States. So it's a signal that the U.S. is not at all interested in a wider war. When you read the Financial Times, remember that you're reading a British newspaper. Britain has been Russophobic and at war with Russia essentially for more than 200 years. Britain hates Russia more than just about anything else Britain does. The U.S. foreign policy is based on a complete fantasy that the U.S. still runs the show or can run the show or can contain China. To my mind, this is all very dangerous and misguided. We need to avoid what John Mearsheimer calls the tragedy of great power politics.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Professor Sachs is a renowned professor of economics at Columbia University. He is a best-selling author of many books, an educator, and he is someone who has worked over the years with governments from various parts of the world. Professor Sachs, welcome to India and Global Left.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
You have been writing about the ongoing conflict in Palestine, and I wanted to start with the US role in this ongoing genocide in Gaza. The Biden administration has now bypassed the Congress twice to pass emergency armed packages, and this is despite a huge documentation about US bombs being dropped in Gaza consistently, including the 2,000 pounds bunker busters that has killed several hundreds. And then there are developments on the other sides, like 60% of Americans don't support Israel in this conflict. There is a new development of US organized labor that is increasingly withdrawing its support. There are constraints on the fiscal side as the US military spending has exceeded $1 trillion, including all the emergency packages. And yet we see a very confident Israel about the US support in this ongoing conflict. Explain to us this.
Well, I think the confidence is misplaced. It has been the fact for decades that the U.S. political system has backed Israel pretty much unconditionally. But I think that this is no longer true. And I think the Israeli leadership calculations are mistaken. The public is very unhappy and very worried about the developments in Gaza. There's very strong opposition to what Israel is doing among younger people. Biden is suffering politically in terms of the opinion polls and election prospects as a result of the disarray of U.S. foreign policy. So I think that if the Israeli government expects that this is the normal smooth ride, they will be mistaken. Now, it's true that there is a powerful pro-Israel lobby. There is a powerful support in the military-industrial complex. It has been the norm in the U.S. Congress to appropriate funds for Israel pretty much without question. Politicians like Biden, who's an old man after all, have taken it for granted that a pro-Israel stand is always the right electoral as well as the right money-raising stand. But I think that this is a wrong assessment by U.S. politicians because the public is not supportive. And it's a wrong assessment, especially by the Israeli politicians, who I think are making a very, very serious miscalculation.
Just to stay on this point, I mean, it is often said that while the American public has a huge leverage in terms of, or at least some leverage in terms of influencing its internal policies, when it comes to foreign policy, it is often said that what goes on in the public doesn't influence a lot in terms of the foreign policies. You have mentioned about the Jewish funding, but there are also talks about the American strategic.
Well, it's not just Jewish funding; it's Christian funding. It's
Yes.
there is a quite broad, and its military-industrial complex funding. It's quite a broad coalition.
Right, absolutely. And I was just coming to the broad region in general. We are seeing a lot of tension with it around the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and rockets being fired by the Houthis, and then US-led coalition has sunk boats on the other side. And we are seeing constant firing across the Lebanon border since October 8th, if not earlier. And effectively, Netanyahu's cabinet, from Gallant to Gantz to his finance ministry, Smotrich, they are essentially calling for war against Iran. Now, to my mind, it's very difficult, or it's almost inconceivable to think about this very extended war by Israel alone if there is no thinking that US is not going to support or back them up. Your thoughts on that?
Well, if the U.S. doesn't back up Israel, Israel can't even keep up the war in Gaza, much less a wider Middle East war. The war in Gaza is supported by U.S. munitions almost on a daily basis. So if the U.S. cuts support, Israel has to stop. Period. It's not a matter of extending to Lebanon, the Red Sea, Iran. That would be a major war. By the way, a major war not only for Israel, but a major war for the United States as well. And the U.S. has just sent one carrier group back from the region back to the United States. So it's a signal that the U.S. is not at all interested in a wider war. There are crazy U.S. politicians like Lindsey Graham who loves war anytime, anywhere. And he said we need to bomb Iran. He used even more extreme language. But basically, this is not the position of the Pentagon, and it's not the position of the American people. You raised the question of whether the public has some say in foreign policy. In general, not very much. But being an election year this year, it's strange, but foreign policy is much more on the agenda because there's a sense that Biden is incompetent, has lost control, that the U.S. is pulled into too many conflicts. And this is weighing on public opinion, especially because Donald Trump has been against funding Ukraine and the
But not Israel, right?
the Republican base is really not in favor of this spending, or particularly in terms of these wars. It's complicated, but I think in general, the mood in the United States is, my God, we've got enough problems at home. What the hell are we doing getting into more and more and more of these wars? And Biden looks very weak and inconsequential, and he's a poor communicator in general. So this is a time when American public opinion is having an effect, especially in the Republican Party, which is not really wanting to fund Biden's adventures abroad.
I remember this foreign affairs column at the peak of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. It was saying that we should bump up our support for NATO. It's not enough because the Republicans can come and they would definitely withdraw support, and we should keep this going. And we would come to Ukraine. But before that, if you could very quickly, if you could lay out this 8-point proposal that you laid out in one of your columns about how to achieve peace in the region.
Well, it's basically one point, which is I would like the UN Security Council today to vote the state of Palestine as a UN member state, and for that to be confirmed by the UN General Assembly, and to get on with the two-state solution. Of course, the current political constellation in Israel is dead set against this. It is absolutely intent on complete control, not only over Israel, but over Palestine. That's the real agenda. It's a self-destructive agenda as well as a deadly agenda vis-a-vis the Palestinian people. And I would like the international community to cut through this and say, look, we've had 57 years of resolutions now, or almost 57 years, UN Security Council Resolution 242. And this is that there need to be two states on the 4 June 1967 borders. And that's it. And we're moving to that solution because otherwise, well, there is no solution of peace. So this is not easy to do, but the alternatives are much worse, actually. So this is what I would recommend. Of course, then there would be peacekeepers, and that would be peacekeepers to separate the two sides, and that seems to me to be utterly feasible. There would be a normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab and Islamic neighbors, but based on Palestine being a sovereign state with control over Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Islamic holy sites. But this is what has been on the table for decades. And I would urge the international community to just move to this solution, because under the UN Charter, Security Council has the power to do this. It is in the interests of global peace to do this. There's one country that blocks it from happening, and that's the United States. And I'm hoping that when the overwhelming global opinion is on the other side, and when the alternative is so horrible as it is, and when the Israeli leaders are so vulgar and violent in their stated intentions, that this will also change the US position.
I want to move to Ukraine, but very quickly, if you can respond to just two additional questions on this. One is, as you mentioned about the Republicans either coming to power or taking charge of, or continuing charge of Congress, and that having some influence. I was wondering if there is a division between Republican policies or intent when it comes to Ukraine or Russia and when it comes to Palestine, because Donald Trump, for instance, during his presidency, while he was a dovish when it came to Russia, he was an absolute hawkish when it came to not just China, but also in Palestine. I mean, his policies were far more regressive than even some kind of moderate Obama. So that's one point. And the other point is many people now are increasingly disillusioned by the idea of the two-state settlement, two-state solution, given there are these 700,000 settlements and so on and so forth. Very quick response, because we have to discuss the rest of it.
Yeah, don't think of the Republican Party or even Donald Trump as having coherent, unified, consistent ideas, either internally consistent or consistent over time. These are political movements, and Donald Trump himself is not a stable personality. So don't look for consistency. When it comes to one-state solution or two-state solution, they're both possible. I think both parties would prefer a two-state solution. That is also international law. The settlements are illegal. The settlers would have to go home to a very large extent. When those settlements took place, they were known to be illegal. The UN Security Council has been very clear over the years that they are illegal. This is the tragedy. Israel tried to put facts on the ground. Well, it put facts on the ground that have led to disaster. That was predictable at the time. It's happening right now. We need an answer. Okay, they could live in one state, but not an apartheid state. That's not an answer for peace. Or they could live in two states. But if they live in two states, they have to solve the problem that hundreds of thousands of settlers, many of them highly religious zealots, listening to biblical ideas from 2,600 years ago, not current realities in the world, need to adjust to current realities. So this is tough. But the current situation, the status quo, is a complete disaster. So I'm saying go with international law, go with decades of international law, go with the solution that both sides claim they prefer to somehow forcing one state together, and therefore solve the problem even of the settlements.
Let's come to Ukraine. On December 30, the New York Times reports on an Ukrainian bombardment of the Russian city of Volgorod that killed 22 people, perhaps the deadliest single attack on a Russian city since the start of the war. And this has been followed up by what the New York Times reports as heavy barrage of hypersonic Russian missiles into cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv and others. So there seems to be a renewed conflict there. My question basically is and this is mostly from my reading of the Financial Times, there seems to be an uneasiness within European elites in particular about some sort of reluctance on part of Washington, D.C. about continuing this war in Ukraine. In fact, Financial Times columnists are writing columns encouraging Ukraine to come up with its own war industries because Washington might not help it anymore. Do you see this to be based on ground, or do you think it's a completely misplaced perception?
First, when you read the Financial Times, remember that you're reading a British newspaper. Britain has been Russophobic and at war with Russia essentially for more than 200 years. Britain hates Russia more than just about anything else Britain does. And Britain has been fighting the Crimean War since 1856. So this is just the Financial Times doing its normal thing. And the British media are even more outrageous than the US media. The fact of the matter is two things. One, this war should have and could have been avoided because it's a war over NATO enlargement, and the United States pushed NATO enlargement stupidly, naively, as a gamble, thinking it would get away with anything. It lost the gamble. That's point number one. Point number two is Russia is crushing Ukraine on the battlefield, and Ukraine is bleeding terribly with hundreds of thousands of deaths and casualties, and is outgunned, outmanned, out-technologied, and the U.S. And the West don't have even in their stockpiles right now the 155 millimeter shells and other equipment. Unless this thing goes nuclear, which would end the world, Russia is prevailing on the battlefield. It's a very straightforward, tragic, again, utterly predictable point. Let me be clear: the U.S. is completely incompetent in foreign policy. So these debacles are foreseeable. These are not retrospective ideas. The Financial Times is filled with nonsense if it thinks that Ukraine is going to fight this on its own. But what it's saying that the U.S. is not pursuing this is probably true. The Congress is going to return this month, most likely turning down further funding for Ukraine. I sure hope so. This funding doesn't do Ukraine any good. It just kills more and more people in Ukraine. It just keeps the war going. Of course, in the end, the military-industrial complex has a powerful lobby, and it may be able to keep another round of some level of aid. But the fact of the matter is the U.S. public is against continued funding. The war is not going the way that these fools in the administration believed that it would, or these gamblers believed that it would. And so I think we are in an end game, and there should be negotiations, just as there were negotiations last year in March and April 2022 that would have ended the war. But the United States said, no, you have to keep fighting because we want to keep enlarging NATO. It's pretty much as simple as that. We need to negotiate an end to the war based on no NATO enlargement.
If there is one voice who seems to be absolutely unwavering in not ending the war, is Zelensky. Like, he seems to be absolutely against ending the. Where does he get the confidence from?
Well, I don't know if it's confidence or desperation, or many people have said to me, he'd be killed if he tried anything different from the inside right wing, or like many politicians who have staked everything on a particular position, he can't back down because that would mean the immediate end of his power. I don't think it's confidence. I think it's complete desperation. And I think we're in an end game.
What's the alternative? What's the opposition to Zelensky that you can think of or imagine replacing in Ukraine?
Well, there could be a coup from inside. There could be a military defeat. There could be a rout on the battlefield. There could be an overthrow of the government. There could be a political change to any of the competitors like Zelensky or others. But the current situation is an end game. Ukraine is being absolutely ravaged and savaged on the battlefield right now. They're trying to mobilize people, basically grabbing them off the streets. It's terrible. I think the public support has disappeared. That's why Zelensky said no elections. So we're very close to the end game.
Let's come to the market transition in Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. You were very close in terms of the project in Poland, and you were involved in some of the early experiments in Russia before you had to back out, or you were probably pushed aside. Before,
No, 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 no.
yes.
Look, these weren't experiments. The idea was to stabilize a financial crisis and to help countries move to a normal mixed economy. In the case of Poland, that was tumultuous but very successful. It launched 30 years of rapid economic development in Poland and a lot of catching up of living standards and technology and so forth. But the reason was that Poland had a geopolitical support from the United States and Europe. The problem with Russia was that the United States viewed Russia as an enemy that it didn't want to support. And in fact, as soon as the Soviet Union went down, the hardliners in the United States, who became called the neocons, said, well, let's break up Russia too. And so the war against the Soviet Union never ended. It just carried on to a kind of war against Russia with NATO enlargement, with other actions to try to undermine Russia's security and its power. So I saw early on, I tried to get US financial support to Gorbachev before the Soviet Union ended, and then to Yeltsin when Russia and the other 14 republics of the Soviet Union became independent states. But in neither case was there any interest in the United States for that kind of constructive approach. So I resigned. I resigned twice, actually. I resigned after the first year, and then the Russian government begged me, please help us one more year. And I tried again, and there was no interest in the last year of the Bush administration, then the first year of the Clinton administration. So I resigned again at the end of 1993. I wasn't pushed aside. I was just useless because what I believed needed to be done was geopolitical, which was to make a normal relationship between the US, Europe, and Russia. And in Poland, that was kind of second nature. But when it came to Russia, it was beyond the imagination or the intention of the US government.
So was it the US lack of cooperation that disillusioned you, or was it Yeltsin being able to push through some of these reforms because his parliament was vetoing some of what
Yeah,
you were suggesting?
this was essentially a geopolitical situation. When you're in such a big crisis, you have to find your place in the world first and foremost. There's a financial crisis. There's a crisis of an end of an empire, the Soviet Union. It's a dissolution of 15 countries. They need trade relations. They need finance, and the international institutions should have been there to help this function. The IMF should have played a role. But the IMF, of course, is on 19th in Pennsylvania, meaning that it's under the thumb of the United States. And the United States told the IMF, no, you don't help. And so this is really what this was about.
I want to ask you a few questions about some of the economic policies that you suggested, the bundle of which has now come to be known as shock therapy, and as you know, has increasingly come under attack, especially from the left. I want you to respond to some of these apprehensions or critiques, if you like. One of the things said is while some of your recommendations about deregulation of price controls, restoration of trade are uncontroversial, but essentially a very rapid deregulation of price control also meant what you suggested was a restrictive monetary policy, which was coupled with a very balanced budget, which led to a contraction of, which could possibly lead to contraction of the economy. And then the second side is about the privatization, which often means, definitely in the case of Russia, is very cheap privatization. There was this biscuit factory which was privatized for seven.
Okay.
Yes.
Look, this is silly. This is not. This is not what I said, and my role had nothing to do with privatization. And so there's so much nonsense about this. I was trying to help prevent a hyperinflation and to help a financial stabilization, not through austerity, quite the contrary, but through financial support for Russia so that there wouldn't have to be that kind of austerity, and through a standstill on debt repayments and a large financing package. That's the opposite of what you're saying. I was not in any way advising even on the privatization issues. And my own advice, which was not asked for because that wasn't what I was there to be doing. I was there as a financial specialist that knows a lot about how to end a financial crisis. But my own advice was the opposite, which was to be careful, go slow, prevent the stealing of enterprises, don't privatize the major resource sector like oil and gas. It's very clear. So a lot of silliness was said, but the media is filled with silliness because we're talking here about technical issues, but things for various reasons were misunderstood. So basically, the bottom line is I was trying to avoid a macroeconomic financial crisis. I was following the basic line of John Maynard Keynes, which is that when a country's in financial crisis, it needs a framework of help from outside, not a framework of punishment. That was my basic idea. It's been my basic idea all along throughout my career. And when that international help comes in a timely way, it can make a very consequential and constructive improvement of what is otherwise a very deep crisis.
I'm glad you pushed back against the privatization thing, because I think, in all honesty, your package didn't include that. I still
Not
like.
at all.
Yes,
So,
yes, yes.
the whole thing's nonsense.
Definitely.
Sorry.
Yes. I'd still like you to very quickly respond to the balanced budget and restrictive monetary policy, which seems to be were part of your package.
The balance, I didn't ask for a balanced budget. I asked for a budget that was not based on monetary financing of a deficit for a large amount. In other words, I was saying, don't balance the budget, get large scale financial help in order so that you don't have to, quote, balance the budget. It's the opposite. It was a financial package to give support in the midst of a crisis. You see, Russia had run out of money. They were in debt. They were supposed to be repaying the debt. I said to the G7, don't ask them to repay the debt. Are you kidding? This is a severe crisis. The G7 said, no, they have to repay every penny that's falling due. It's the opposite.
Yes, I mean, when it comes to the international side, you are definitely.
No. International side's about the budget, you understand.
But what about the fiscal deficit
The
aspect?
fiscal deficit is exactly, if you give money to a budget, you allow it to run a deficit in a non-inflationary way. That's it. I was trying to help them run a deficit, you see?
Right.
I was trying to get them revenues so that they could continue all of the social functions, all of the normal functions, so that they would avoid a deep financial crisis. Exactly the opposite. I was the one saying 30 billion a year for the former Soviet Union coming from the outside. People thought I was crazy. What a bargain it would have been.
What's your general assessment of the post-communist transition in Eastern Europe? You have been very open about your thoughts on Poland. You see it as a successful experiment. What's your general thought about Eastern Europe's transition? Because there are apprehensions about Eastern Europe itself. Many people say even cities like Warsaw that didn't used to have beggars are now have many more. So what's your
Are you kidding? Were you there? What? Come on, what nonsense. Look, in 1989 or 88, Poland was about a third of the per capita income level of Germany. Now it's about 70%. In other words, it's doubled relative to its German next door neighbor. That's what happens when you end the trade and finance barriers, integrate the economies, have Poland being a major industrial supplier for European industry. It became integrated into the normal European economy. That's the benefit of European Union membership. And by and large, it's geographic. If you're close to the Western European countries, you do better. If you're farther away, you do less well, because say a major company like Siemens or Volkswagen is looking for suppliers. It could go next door to Poland, or it could go farther to Romania and Bulgaria. Well, what will it do for its supply chain? It will tend to go closer. So there's a big geographic gradient in reform naturally, which is that the countries closest to the Western European countries did better. Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovenia, Slovakia. The ones that are farther away, like Romania and Bulgaria, did less well. The places where there was chaos, like the former Yugoslavia, did even less well. The places behind the former Soviet Union, in general, did even less well, except the Baltics were grabbed for both strategic reasons and because of their very small size, and integrated into the Northern European economic matrix very quickly. So there's a lot of basic economic geography overlaid with geopolitics in this. That's the basic story.
Can I leave you with one final question, if your time
Sure.
permits? There is a lot being spoken about the future of US-China relationship, and that has a huge implication for the rest of the world. Can you share your thoughts about how you look at this relationship going forward?
Well, the big issue is China has become a superpower in every dimension, economic, technological, military, obviously population, though it's number 2 to India. But essentially, that's fine It means that the major powers, China, India, European Union, United States, should be cooperating with each other and finding a good modus vivendi. But in the American mentality, America needs to be number one. America needs to have dominance. So the U.S. foreign policy is based on a complete fantasy that the U.S. Still runs the show or can run the show or can contain China. And so this is the root of the extreme tensions between the US and China, basically US resentment at China's success. And the US is therefore trying to hinder China, trying to contain China, trying to slow China's rise, trying to organize military alliances against China. To my mind, this is all very dangerous and misguided. China is just having a return to economic success. And it should be applauded, not opposed. So I'm for a cooperative, multipolar, multilateral approach. India is going to be the same situation right now. India and the U.S., say that they are close in foreign policy, but when India gets too powerful and successful, the United States will turn against India too. So basically, we need to avoid what John Mearsheimer calls the tragedy of great power politics. And he says it's inevitable that there should be conflict among great powers because they fight for each other for survival. I say to him, John, we don't need tragedy, we need cooperation. So countries should cooperate with each other, stop the bullying. If the United States never again used the phrase rule-based international order, it would be too soon, because that just has become the code stock phrase for the US-led order. We don't need a US-led order. We need a multipolar, multilateral order, starting with the UN Charter. I'd like to see India join the UN Security Council as a permanent member. It obviously should be there. So we need some reforms of the UN system, but basically we need multilateralism, not great power showdowns. But the United States, for the moment, is still in a mentality of thinking it's the indispensable leader of the world, which is nonsense. It's just 4% of the world population. We've, by the way, gotten enough problems internally and domestically, politically, economically, and socially, that we have a lot of healing to do in the United States without trying to run the rest of the world.
Did you convince Professor Mearsheimer? Because he seems to be believing that the idea of US hegemony is something indispensable or the whole world will fall into chaos. What did he respond to you?
He doesn't say it quite that way. What he says is that it's inevitable that the US will seek hegemonic power, that that's the tragedy of great power politics, that great powers are inevitably led to seek either regional or even global hegemony. I say no. We don't agree on that. We're good friends. I admire him enormously, but we don't agree because if you write a book called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, my view is you have to solve the tragedy. You can't just leave it as a tragedy. We have to say, okay, that's the risk. What's the solution? John says, well, there is no solution. That's the reality. And I say, no, there is a solution. The solution is multilateralism and multipolarity.
On that note of optimism, Professor Sachs, thank you very much for your time. It has been a pleasure to have you on.
Likewise, thanks a lot. Great to be
Have a
with you.
wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.